Hey friends. Tonight, we're doing something a little strange and a little stinky. So go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe grab a soft blanket. Let the day melt off your shoulders. And if you're feeling adventurous, light a candle or turn on a fan for that faint whisper of medieval air circulation. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you watching from? It is always so oddly comforting to know we all here together in this sleepy corner of the universe, drifting off across time and space to a time where toilets were, well, not really a thing. So let's head back. The blanket scratches. The roof leaks. Your knee hurts for no clear reason. Dark, damp. Your head's cold, but your feet are oddly warm. Probably because you slept too close to the hearth. And someone has goat peed there during the night. That faint pressure in your belly. The unwelcome awareness that nature, once again, demands an answer. You open your eyes. But because you hoping the communal pit hasn't collapsed or flooded again. Or worse, frozen. It's not a dream, not exactly. It's just your breath. And the faint gurgle in your gut that says, hurry up. No, it's the 1300s. You're a peasant, and pooping is a project. It's not much. A few uneven planks, a makeshift roof, and a slanted seat with a jagged hole cut in. Or rather, you hover, because nothing in here feels stable enough to trust with your full weight. And just as you lower yourself with the grace of a Huron attempting yoga, a rat squeaks somewhere beneath the boards. The floor creaks ominously, and you've heard stories of people falling through, not rumors, but actual cautionary tales told by your mother while she peeled onions. The smell punches you gently in the face. The air smells like wet sheep, burned oats, and decay. Always decay. Something is always decaying. You're lying on a straw mattress, which is an overly generous term for what is essentially a sack stuffed with flattened grass, mouse droppings, and whatever you pulled from the field that looked vaguely soft. And before you've even sat up fully, there it is. Or in this case, rogue pigs who like to investigate whatever comes out of human bodies. The waste simply joins the growing pile in the pit below, a bubbling stew of contributions from the entire family, and sometimes the neighbors. Instead, you reach for the basket of things beside you, moss, a scrap of wool, or your least favorite corn husk. If you're lucky, there's a smooth river stone that someone remembered to heat by the fire earlier. You scratch your nose and immediately regret it. You, a human being, image of the divine, crouched over a freezing hole, using last season's hay to preserve your dignity. Perhaps a wolf. Perhaps just old Miriam singing again in her dreams. You have to poop. A shift. The unmistakable sound of someone else making that same bleak journey to the outhouse. Misery shared is somehow less miserable. She swears it helps. You're not convinced. You eat it quickly while your father sharpens tools and your sister plucks lice from your tunic. A grunt. A muttered curse. A pause. A splash. But this isn't the modern world, where you could just shuffle in socks across a warm floor, flip a switch, and sit in porcelain comfort. First, there's the mental prep. You say a little prayer, not because you're holy, though who isn't, with death a sneeze away. Your little brother mumbles in his sleep and rolls over, clutching a wooden doll that vaguely resembles a person. You slowly rise, stretch your stiff shoulders, and grab a wooden stick you've sharpened just enough to keep dogs away. And far too many opinions claim someone fell into the waste trench behind the church and hasn't been seen since. People are torn between horror and amusement. The priest says it's a sign from God. The midwife says it's just bad construction. Sometimes people simply fling it from windows, and certainly not with your mouth open. Especially in towns where space is tight and time is shorter. Guard Lou. They shout, the old warning to get out of the way. Medieval for heads up, but with significantly higher stakes. You push open the wooden door, which groans like an old man with gout, and step into the muddy yard. And that he uses a different chamber pot for each bowel movement, encrusted with jewels and polished by monks. You suspect she's lying, but also, you kind of believe her. Your stomach growls again. You'll shovel out animal pens, gather firewood, mend a fence, and maybe, if you re-lucky, bathe once this month in the freezing stream out back. Hygiene is not a luxury in your world. It's a gamble. There's no moon tonight, just stars and fog and a silence so deep you can hear your own breath. The family's outhouse, or what they call the hole, sits at the edge of the yard near the compost. But this is life. You step inside. Do they use velvet cloths? Do they sit upon golden seats? Is their poop less offensive? Do they even poop at all? The seat is cold, colder than anything should ever be. You pause. The urge fades, then returns twice as strong. You do your business quickly. There's no toilet paper, of course. You wipe with something that feels wrong. You don't look. And then comes the part no one talks about, the shameful, existential moment where you sit in silence and reflect on the sheer absurdity of your situation. You sigh. You stand. You do not flush. There's nothing to flush. You exit quickly, inhaling the fresh, yet still manure-tinged night air. The stars twinkle as if trying not to laugh. Back inside, you warm your hands by the fire, which hasn't been fed since yesterday. You lie back on the straw sack and try not to think about what's now on your hands, despite your best efforts to avoid touching anything in there. Sleep does not come easily. You listen to the sounds of your village, someone snoring, a baby fussing, a distant howl, and then there it is. A creak. You smile faintly. In the morning, your mother sprinkles ashes over the pit to tamp the smell. Breakfast is a hard crust of bread and something that may have been milk 2 days ago. And just as you finish the last bite, the cycle continues. This was only the beginning of your day. You wonder, briefly, how the rich live. Your neighbor insists the king hasn't pooped since his coronation. Later that week, the village gossip. A stout man with no eyebrows. You don't know what to believe. But that night, you walk a little more carefully. Not all waste ends up in pits. You learn quickly not to walk too close to buildings. Sometimes, if you're standing in the market and the wind shifts, you catch it. That smell. Not the comforting stink of pig, or the predictable rot of old onions, but something worse. Something human, sour and ancient. It snakes through the air like a whisper from the underworld. It could be coming from the butcher's trench, where runoff collects behind the stall, or the leather tannery, where hides soak in urine and quicklime until they resemble something you might wear if you had no self-respect and nowhere else to be. Or maybe, most likely, it's coming from the street itself. Because here is the thing no one quite prepares you for about medieval life. Everything is closer than it should be. Life, death, filth, food, and occasionally relieve yourself if it is late enough and the church bell has rung, and you be pretty sure no one is looking. All mashed together like a stew gone wrong. The street is where you walk, but it's also where you spit, dump, throw. They believe if you boil it hard enough, it stops being evil. A theory disproven almost daily by the rising number of coughing children and red-eyed goats. You saw him last week, singing to his own shoes behind the bakery. He waved at you. His robe was on backward. Best not to look too closely. You watch a boy toss a chamber pot out the window of a second-floor tenement. It makes a wet sound when it lands. The chickens scatter. A woman curses. The boy laughs. The idea seems fancy until you realize that indoor often means a wooden bench over a vertical shaft that leads elegantly straight into the basement. A basement that's slowly fermenting under your feet. You sigh and tighten your cloak. Your boots squelch with every step, and you tell yourself that what's on them is just mud, except for the echo of your own internal regrets. At the town's edge, there's a stream that carries waste away, or is supposed to, but on hot days, it just sits there, sluggish and judgmental, gathering little rainbow sheens of oil and the occasional dead rat. You suspect it just ended up in someone else's drinking well. But still, it felt refined, luxurious, like using a quill instead of your finger to scratch an itch. But it's hard, especially when one of them makes eye contact on the way out and nods solemnly. The view, the breeze, the faint hope that your waist might hit a squirrel on the way down, as if to say, yes, brother, we all suffer. There is a tale, whispered by traveling minstrels with far too much glee, of a lord who met his end not in battle, but in the garderobe. The floor gave way. He plunged straight into the moat. You live in the in-between, not noble, not wretched, just medieval, with a job to do, a hole to dig, and a belly that rumbles at the worst possible times. Barley, hops, fermentation, a divine accident that turned beer into medicine. For the stomach, for the nerves, and occasionally as a very poor substitute for courage. Winter, with its icy dread and frozen privies. Spring, when everything thaws and you remember just how bad the trench behind the smithy can smell. People still wash clothes in it, bless their optimism. In judging the risk of using a communal seat versus simply wandering into the woods and squatting like your ancestors. Worse, some folks still drink from it. Of garderobes, little stone chambers built into the outer walls, where waste could drop straight down into the moat. That's why ale is the preferred drink, not because it gets you tipsy, though that's a perk, but because it's safer than the water. Even your village priest drinks it, though he insists it's purely medicinal. Chatting, grunting, passing the time, and the sponge on a stick. Nothing says turn your army around like realizing the water you're trying to cross smells like a week-old chamber pot. But the idea of shared humanity, of people gathering not in glory, but in gastrointestinal solidarity, feels oddly comforting. But you're not here to judge. You're here to survive. And survival means understanding your environment. That includes the outhouses, of which there are many kinds, some noble, some laughably tragic, of pipes and clever engineering, of waste being carried away, like a secret, never to be seen again. In towns, some inns offer indoor privies. On warm days, the smell rises through the floorboards like a ghost with digestive issues. You once stayed in such an inn. The food was excellent. The dreams were not. Some monasteries had more advanced systems. Stone channels, running water, a clever little pipe that carried waste downstream, where it allegedly disappeared forever. The monks called it a reridorter, a word that sounds suspiciously fancy until you sit on one. Cold stone, narrow seat, absolute silence. You try not to imagine the holy men before you, their robes hitched, brows furrowed in contemplation. In contrast, castles had their own peculiar innovations. You've never been inside a castle, but you've heard the stories. A moat, full of feces. People think moats were for keeping out invaders, but you suspect their real purpose was psychological warfare. Still, there's a certain elegance to the castle latrine. Though, of course, accidents happened. A crappy death, they say quite literally. But you don't live in a castle. Years pass. You get used to the rhythms, the seasonal bowel routines. Summer, with its sour fruits and hasty dashes to the bushes. You become an expert in timing, in choosing the right moss. Sometimes you wonder, how did people before you manage? The Romans, they say, had public toilets. Long stone benches with holes, side by side, where people sat like old friends at a feast. A sponge on a stick. You try not to think too much about that part. You imagine Caesar himself, trousers down, discussing empire between grunts. Maybe not, but it's a nice image. More recently, there's been talk of plumbing. You dream of that, of a world where toilets flush, where paper is soft, where smells are optional, not mandatory. But you also suspect it comes with trade-offs, new diseases, strange chemicals, people forgetting how to squat properly. There's an art to it, after all, a balance, a depth of squat that protects the knees and humbles the soul. You chuckle softly to yourself. You've seen visitors try it. Outsiders. They bend wrong, lose their footing, tip over, end up in the trench. One even lost a shoe. You never got it back. There was once a man named Tib the tiler, though no one remembered him for his tiling. He lived in a crooked house near the edge of the village, just beyond the pig path, where the wind always carried a whiff of something unpleasant, no matter the season. Some said it was the bog, others said it was Tib. He was a man of odd habits. He hummed while chewing. He chewed while sleeping. He wore the same tunic every day, not because he was poor, but because, in his words, it already knows me. Or, depending on who you asked, a dangerous fascination. But what set Tib apart was not his clothes or his smell, or even his tendency to talk to spoons. No, Tib had a gift, or a curse. Some found this impressive, others concerning. Compared them like wine connoisseurs compare oak notes and tannins. Tib could tell you the year a trench was dug by the tilt of the boards. He could recite, from memory, the stool arrangements of every household in the village. A thick leather-bound book, locked with a nail and tucked under his bed. No one ever read it. No one wanted to. He loved latrines, not just used them. Loved them. Studied them. He once claimed to have sat upon every known seat within a 10-mile radius. Not just smell-resistant, perfect. Tib believed that what a man left behind told you more than his words ever could. You can fake a smile, he said once, poking at a compost pile with a stick, but you can't fake fiber. Dug a pit as deep as his arm, plus a shovel plus 2 more arms. Just a door left slightly ajar, creaking in the morning mist. He built walls from salvaged timber, laid stones by moonlight, and spent 3 days shaping a seat from a single slab of oak. He kept a diary. Then one day, Tib announced he'd had a vision. He claimed, with the trembling conviction of a man who's eaten the wrong mushrooms, that he was going to build the perfect privy. Not just better. It will face the sunrise, he whispered, and the seat will not splinter. People laughed. Then people ignored him. And then, as the days passed and the hammering began, people started to wonder. He cleared the brush behind his hut. The village children watched from a distance, hiding behind bushes and giggling at every grunt. Like a monk who'd glimpsed eternity through a perfectly placed hole in the wall. Someone tried to steal the design. A man named Osric, but the moment he sat on his copied version, the floor gave way, and he was found 3 hours later, covered in bees and regret. Tib, on the other hand, completed his project in silence, and when it was done, he said nothing. With no water, the trench pits overflowed. The air turned foul. Crops withered. People whispered of curses, of omens, of that one time someone spat near the chapel, offered up his privy. No grand unveiling, no ribbon cutting. It became a sort of legend. People claimed it smelled like rosemary, that the seat warmed itself with some ancient magic, that inside you could hear birdsong even in winter. No one truly knew, because Tib wouldn't let anyone else use it. It's not for others, he said, gently stroking the doorframe. It's for reflection. Then they knocked. Then they panicked. And reflect he did. Each morning, with a fresh mug of ale and a thoughtful expression, Tib would stroll to his sanctuary, close the door, and vanish for 27 minutes exactly. People timed him. People placed bets. He emerged always with a glow. But then came the drought. The village well ran dry. The stream turned to sludge. Animals grew thin, and tempers grew thinner. And that's when it happened. Tib, it is not just a seat, he said, but a gift to the people. May it bring relief. The door swings gently with the wind, creaking like a tired prayer. The line formed before dawn. Men, women, even the blacksmith's horse waited their turn, who chased the dream of a splinterless seat and found something greater. You glance at the door. You wonder. They brought tokens, apples, buttons, a rather confused chicken, and left them at the door in gratitude. And for a brief, beautiful week, the village knew peace. Arguments were settled with a quiet nod toward the perfect privy. Even the priest admitted that confession felt unnecessary after 5 minutes in that hallowed space. Then, as all things do, it ended. One morning, Tib entered and did not return. At first, people thought he was reflecting extra hard. They forced the door. Inside, nothing. No Tib, no body. Just a warm seat and a faint smell of lavender. Some say he was taken by angels. Some say he finally achieved enlightenment, dissolved into steam. Others insist he just crawled out the back and moved to the next village. But the privy remained, and in time, it was left alone. No one dared use it again. It felt too sacred. Now it sits, weathered and quiet, ivy creeping up the sides. Children dare each other to peek inside. They rarely do. The old folks still speak of Tib, of the man who loved poop more than propriety. You sometimes walk past it on your way to gather firewood. And just for a moment, your belly rumbles. The wind shifts, and the seat calls. But you keep walking. Not today. Not yet. There's something oddly profound about the fact that every culture, every kingdom, every wandering band of dust-covered traders had to figure out the same thing. Where does it go? And more importantly, what do we do until it does? Because across the patchwork lands of medieval Europe, from the fog-choked alleys of York to the windswept coasts of Brittany, from Moorish Spain to crumbling monasteries in the Alps, everyone pooped. Kings, beggars, bishops, and barmaids. And while no one sang songs about it, the evidence remains. In ruins and relics. In pipes and pots and strangely detailed manuscripts that someone, bless them, decided to illustrate with great enthusiasm and questionable perspective. You once saw a marginal doodle in an illuminated manuscript of a man fighting a giant snail with a shovel, while another figure squatted in the background, trousers around his ankles, clearly losing a different kind of battle. The monk who drew it, scholars believe, may have been bored. You took in the world, bread, wine, meat, sin, and transformed it into something new, something foul, something necessary. It was your body's way of releasing the humors, of balancing bile and blood, of humbling the soul. Or honest, or both. Galen, the ancient Greek physician beloved by medieval doctors, had entire sections on bowel movements. A servant would collect the product in a fine ceramic bowl, bring it to the household physician, and receive a consultation on the owner's health based solely on color and consistency. He was very concerned with texture, timing, and frequency. A medieval wellness influencer, if you like. Some medieval thinkers believed that digestion was a form of divine alchemy, that the devil, in some cases, could dwell in your bowels if you hadn't confessed in a while. If too slow, perhaps a mixture of warm goose fat and powdered clove rubbed, gently, onto the lower back. Medieval medicine was imaginative, and no bodily function escaped its scrutiny. Applied to the thighs, or the temples, or for the particularly adventurous, right on the well. Let's not, or elsewhere, depending on your level of trust. which perhaps explains why everyone spoke so softly after a long visit to the privy. Monks wrote about it, philosophers too, meant to ward off demons, witches, and, in some areas, fairies. Yes, fairies. And then there were the remedies. Or mutter something about St. Bridget under your breath, just to be safe. Ah, yes, the remedies. If your bowels were too loose, you might be advised to drink boiled blackberry root mixed with crushed limestone and a touch of red wine. But in those dark, warm, food-adjacent places, rats thrived. And yes, there were tailies. You kept it under the bed, next to your boots, and emptied it when the sun rose or your patience ran out. Others, surprisingly ornate, painted, gilded, decorated with slogans like, "Do thy business and be gone," or "Mind thy aim, good sir." Not because they were unclean, but because those places were liminal, boundaries between the body and the earth, the seen and unseen. Historians can't agree whether it was a joke or a truly confused courtship gift. Leeches, of course, were a popular suggestion for nearly everything. Some noble households even employed a physic stool, a sort of ceremonial chair meant not for seating but for diagnosing. The cow, curious as always, watched from the fence. Imagine being that servant. Imagine being that bull. Then again, the physicians themselves weren't much luckier. It fertilized fields. It made things grow. Yours, by contrast, was often seen as a problem. Too human. Too dangerous. People believed your dreams were influenced by your digestion. That ghosts could possess you through improperly expelled wind. Old Roman sites, crumbled monasteries. Places where walls remain, but people do not. There are recorded exorcisms involving excessive farting. True story. In fact, the act of passing gas was such a confusing event that some villagers believed it carried your thoughts, that the soul, momentarily weakened during defecation, might release stray ideas into the air. And then there were the toilet charms. The grooves in the stone worn down by centuries of sitting. Someone sighed. Little rhyming prayers carved into wooden stalls or whispered under the breath before squatting. Particularly in Ireland, in the western reaches of the Isles, it was said that fairies loved to dwell near waste sites, so you might carry a charm, or a cold iron nail. In other regions, it was rats you feared. Some privies, particularly in wealthier towns, had vertical shafts made of stone or brick that led deep into underground cesspits. Tailies of rats climbing up, of unexpected nibbles, of a merchant in Bruges who claimed he was bitten mid-defecation and swore off spices forever. He later died of unrelated causes, but the fear lived on. This may be why some people preferred the chamber pot. Ah, the humble pot. Not elegant, not glamorous, but dependable. Some pots were plain, clay or pewter. There's even one museum in England that houses a Tudor era pot inscribed with a love poem. You hope it was both, but let's not forget the animals. Because in most places, especially rural ones, you did not go alone. Not metaphorically, not literally. Your chickens followed. The pig lingered. They knew, they smelled it, and they too had business. Animal waste, in many ways, was more valued than yours. Some alchemists, however, believed otherwise. They collected it, oiled it, distilled it into tinctures. They were very proud of their tinctures. One even claimed to turn lead into gold using fermented human feces and powdered antler. No one could prove him wrong, mostly because no one wanted to smell the lab. You wander through ruins now and again, when your chores are light and your thoughts are heavier than usual. And sometimes, in those quiet corners, you see them, the remnants, the pits, the drains. They remind you that every story, no matter how grand, has a back end. That history, despite the art and poetry and wars, was mostly made by tired people with bad backs, trying to find a clean place to go. You touch the moss on the wall and think, Here, once, someone paused, someone grunted, and then they went on with their day, just like you will. Up at the manor house, past the sheep fields and the muddy lanes, past the alewife's sagging fence and the blacksmith's endless hammering, things looked cleaner, or at least they pretended to. But sometimes, if your mother was needed for washing, or your cousin played the lute just well enough to amuse the steward, you might be summoned. You weren't often allowed through the gates, and when you were, it was hard not to stare. The walls were stone, yes, cold and drafty like yours, but there were rugs, actual rugs, hung on walls, spread under chairs, as if dirt and fleas were no longer part of the human experience. The air smelled less like livestock and more like dried herbs, lavender, thyme, and something sweet you couldn't name. There were cushions on the benches. There was a fire that never went out. There was bread with butter. But what stayed with you most, long after the visit ended, was the privy. It wasn't called a toilet, of course. That word didn't exist yet, not really. The term was garderobe, which sounded rather dignified until you saw it. It was a small room built into the outer wall of the tower. A stone alcove with a narrow wooden bench, polished by noble behinds, and a hole carved with perfect medieval geometry. They were, for all practical purposes, glorified sewage ponds. A defensive feature, yes, but also an olfactory one. A small arched window with a view of the hills, perhaps. And sometimes a servant. The waste, it dropped straight into the moat. Now, if you've ever dreamed of living in a castle, this next bit may dim the shine. Most castle moats weren't filled with sparkling water. Another married into nobility. And one, legend has it, fell asleep during duty and was gently replaced. Many an invading soldier reconsidered their choices after wading through the fragrant offerings beneath a castle wall. You knew his rhythms, his fiber intake, his moods, his seat preferences. But unlike your humble clay pot, theirs were often made of pewter, brass, even porcelain. Some were engraved, some had gold rims. One had a family crest painted inside the bowl. But for the lord or lady, perched delicately above it all, there was privacy, solitude, down a chute, into a pit, into the moat, or in cities, out the window with a cry of garde l'eau, French for watch out for the water, but more accurately translated as duck or suffer. Yes, the groom of the stool, a real title, a real job. His duty? To assist the monarch, not just with robes and basin and towel, but with everything. It was considered an honor, a sacred trust. You were closer to the king than even his generals or advisors. Perfume was preferred to soap. Underwear was, at best, optional. And velvet, while beautiful, is a poor fabric for accidents. But from her own corset, squeezing her digestive tract with such force that her bowels simply gave up. One groom of the stool went on to become a powerful political advisor. Imagine the job interview. So, do you have experience with chamber pots? He broke his ankle, screamed for 3 hours, and required 6 men to carry him from the scene. He later banned prunes from the estate. She believed it aligned the humors. Her staff kept charts. Her astrologer was promoted. Speaking of which, chamber pots were common in noble households, just as they were in yours. Because they knew the stars had nothing to do with it. And the contents? Not their problem. A marble chair with a hole in the middle used to verify certain details. We won't get into it. Catholicism, at the time, was very thorough. Servants, usually the lowest ranked, were tasked with emptying the pots discreetly. In China, ancient sewer systems outclassed anything in Paris for another 500 years. In Mesoamerica, toilets were designed with airflow and sun exposure in mind. Of course, the nobles didn't smell much better than you. They bathed less. It was placed in a small, candlelit room called a closet, which is where we get the modern term. So next time you hang a shirt in yours, remember, someone somewhere once hung their dignity in there too. You once heard a story about a duchess who fainted at court, not from hunger or emotion. The maid who cleaned her gown was paid double that day. She later retired. Royalty, of course, had it worse, or better. It depends on how you look at it. Kings and queens were surrounded by attendants, which meant, quite literally, they rarely did anything alone. Not even that. The French King Louis XIV is said to have held court while seated on his commode, discussing treaties, issuing commands, all while taking his royal relief. It's said the chamber pot was covered in silk. It's also said that no one questioned it, because what was etiquette to a man whose throne was also a throne? In some palaces, the toilet was a carved chair with a velvet cushion and a removable bowl. But even the finest arrangements didn't prevent mishaps. One nobleman, a baron of no small pride, reportedly slipped on a wet stone floor while hurrying to relieve himself. Another, a countess in Prague, insisted on only pooping under a specific moon phase. Meanwhile, down in the kitchens, the servants laughed. Everyone poops, eventually. Even the Pope had a specially designed toilet, known as the sedia stercoraria. So whether you were crowned or crawling, your body still made demands. And every culture had its rituals, its strategies, its little workarounds. In parts of the Middle East, they used running water centuries before Europe figured it out. Meanwhile, in much of Europe, you still had to check the seat for slugs. Progress, it turns out, is not evenly distributed. And yet, despite the smells, the stains, the splinters, and the shame, there's something deeply comforting about the whole thing. Because in the end, no matter your title or tunic, your prayer or posture, you needed a moment of stillness, a pause, a place to let go. And maybe that's what the medieval privy offered more than anything. Not just relief, but a kind of peace. A stone seat warmed by sunlight, a curtain pulled across a drafty doorway, a view of the field, the birds, the sky, a few minutes to be alone, to think, to reflect, to simply be human. You breathe out. The night is quiet now. The village is still. Somewhere, a dog shifts in its sleep. You lie back in your straw bed, the chill slowly giving way to warmth, your thoughts drifting like smoke through the rafters. And you realize, in this world of mud and stars, where kings fall and peasants rise, where castles crumble and trenches overflow, you too are part of the great cycle. Not a throne, not a chamber pot, just part of it all. And slowly, softly, you fall asleep,